Good evening. I'm Scott Clowney, Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs. Tonight's program is part of Architecture Everywhere, a monthly series organized by the Washington Architectural Foundation, exploring how architecture comes to life in unexpected ways through other arts and humanities disciplines. In this presentation, I'm thrilled to welcome James Gulliver Hancock, a well-traveled illustrator based in Sydney, Australia. James is obsessed with drawing. His work has appeared across the globe on everything from books, furniture, and clothing to ceramics, board games, and billboards. Some clients include Coca-Cola, Sydney Opera House, and the New York Times. I'll put links to James's portfolio and Instagram profile in the chat. Tonight, James will share with us his whimsical drawing style and describe why architecture is the perfect subject to reimagine on paper. With that, a few housekeeping notes. By participating in this webinar, you are granting your permission to be recorded and for the recording to be distributed as AIADC and the Washington Architectural Foundation may choose. If you have any questions or comments during the program, please use the Q&A or chat features and we'll follow up with those afterwards. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, James Gulliver Hancock. James, thanks for being with us.
Hi, thanks for having me. Welcome to my studio. It's a pleasure for me to be here and have a chat to you guys about what I do and take you through a bunch of stuff from how I began and how I envisage using illustration in architecture and all sorts of other little tangents I'll take you on. This is my studio in Australia. I'm in Australia at the moment. I've spent a lot of time in the US, but at the moment Australia is my home, and I've got this little cabin in the rainforest basically where I have a little studio that I do everything from digital design, drawing, collage, ceramics, woodwork, all sorts of things. I'm just going to jump into my slides, share my screen, and we can get cracking on that. Here we go. All right, there we go. I'm just going to start off by prefacing that I'm not an architect. I get a lot of people saying that, asking me technical architecture questions, but I didn't study architecture. I did study at a design school that was part of a school that was design, architecture, and building, but we never really had much to do with the architects, unfortunately. I'll get into what I studied a bit later, but I have drawn a lot of buildings, so I can see why people think I'm involved in architecture. And I think there's something about illustration that can bring to architecture, especially, and objects like that are static, that can bring them to life and give them another way, give people another way of seeing those things that they deal with every day. So here's the Flatiron building and a couple of different ways in which I've interpreted it. A more sketchy version on the left up to a more abstracted collage-y version on the right. Illustration allows me to show things in a new way to people and represent them for interpretation in many different ways. This is me as a little kid. I've always drawn. I'm just going to go through some history now. Drawing was always an obsession of mine, and I'll talk a bit about obsession throughout this because it's been a big part of my career, being totally focused on something. I mean, drawing has been the backbone of everything to date, basically, whether it's going into ceramics or woodwork or whatever it is. The project usually starts with drawing, pencil and paper. It's not very technical. I just find that an easy way to think, and I think I'll be talking quite a lot about that too, this method of using drawing as a place to let ideas flow and make mistakes and see what happens and embrace those mistakes, basically. As I mentioned, I studied at university at this UTS in Sydney, University of Technology, in the design, architecture and building faculty. And basically we were thrown in with a lot of other designers, unfortunately not the architects, but we were with fashion designers, industrial designers, and ourselves, visual communications. But they tried to get us to do a lot of different things, which has been incredibly useful for my career, basically. We, at the time, I've got a few things there, it was early days in digital design. So, there's what did we used to call it? The stealth bomber, the MacBook Pro there, and the zip drives were always dying and stuff like that. So that was pretty challenging. And yeah, early days of Flash and doing websites with Dreamweaver, but there was always this playfulness with non-digital formats. So we were photocopying and making zines, taking photos, processing them, animating those photos by hand, using, you know, video cameras with traditional deck-to-deck editing. So it was really, really hands-on, which was quite amazing for later on being able to think outside of just working on an iPad and delivering it like that. You know, now I've got a lot of techniques that I can pull in and generate stuff that's out of the ordinary. And it allows you to think in a lot of different ways, which is great. Think and see in different ways. Encouraged us to, yeah, think across different mediums. I mean, the funny thing about organic, non-digital formats is you make a lot of mistakes. And I've mentioned that before, and I'll mention it again. But whenever I've taught classes in illustration or talked about my architecture drawings, it's the mistakes, in inverted commas, that are what makes them sort of original, I guess. The drawings aren't perfect, and you get to see a sort of different version of this thing. It's not like anyone's going to build a building from my drawings, but there's an information level there that's beyond what's in reality through those mistakes. The little wibbly bits of ink that might have fallen here and there give it a whole new romance and familiarity in a way. Once I left university, I moved into this amazing ornate building on a really busy road. We lived upstairs with a group of us that left uni together, an industrial designer, myself, and another guy who luckily enough worked at a Kinko's, so we got to do a lot of photocopying. And down the bottom, there was an open space that we ran as a gallery. So we had a lot of different artists coming through, local artists. We had experimental music nights. It wasn't a way to make money. It was just a way to bring people in and share ideas, basically. It was quite an amazing time and experience for us all. We tried to tie together friends that we had doing more visual art stuff with design stuff, with all different mediums. Everyone was welcome to come in and try different things. So that was a pretty amazing time. During that time, I came out of uni and I thought, I'm going to be a visual artist, not a designer. And I did, have a lot of exhibitions, and I still do have personal work exhibitions, but drawing was, as I said, always the backbone. So I would always be drawing the things around me, the building, that I drew that while I was there, the one before of where we lived. And this is me drawing another one in the area. And it was always those things that were a part of my daily life that I would draw. I was less interested in drawing fanciful worlds, science fiction-y kind of stuff, and more interested in looking at what was around me and trying to represent it in different ways. So this is obviously not my work, Gary's work. The amazing process that he goes through, I think, is relevant to how I'm talking about sketching in architecture and how it can be useful to come up with ideas before they're built, and also just sketching and recording ideas once things are built and they're in front of you. So this is a process of his, doing these really, really loose sketches at the beginning, and just trying to come up with forms and letting even, tiny little wobbly, wibbly marks that might not be anything might become this huge, amazing structure afterwards. So letting yourself be in that place that allows for those things to happen is hard, but it's very important. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with your ways of making marks, your ways of being playful, your ways of seeing different things. And there's a difference between this kind of sketching and illustrating. This sketching is really sort of a thinking with drawing. Your brain, you're not trying to create a drawing that people want to put in a frame or, use on a poster or whatever it is. It's about putting down ideas quickly. It's like I find it even quicker than writing down ideas. Usually when I'm sketching ideas, it's stuff like this. That's, there's going to be something here, and you're just representing it with a square or something. So personal symbols come out quite quickly in this stuff. The difference then to illustration is that it becomes more refined a little bit, I guess. I mean, those symbols that you develop there might get more recognizable, so other people can interpret them. There's sort of, this sketching phase can be more personal, I suppose, personally understood, whereas illustration is usually for a universal understanding, or you're hoping for that. In relevance to that sort of process between sketching and illustrating. This was a project for Herman Miller that I did quite a long time ago, early in my illustration career, that tried to keep that sense of sketching and that sense of personal symbols in the final illustration. So they had this very broad text about building spaces that are flexible. So, one, might be a pharmacy 1 minute, and then you change it to an open plan office, and then you change it to a residential place. This idea that you could adapt buildings without demolishing them and starting them again. So there was a lot of drawing buildings, drawing plans, drawing things that are recognizable to people, but also me just embracing the fact that I love drawing triangles that join together. The fact that I loved drawing squares that became not squares and started falling off the page. Those personal symbols meshed in with recognizable ones of doors and windows. It was fun to have a client for this because we could back and forth on it. It was sort of almost like an artistic project in a way, being so personally symbolic, but if we had to make it communicate. So they would come back to me with ideas about what things that I had drawn communicated to them. So it was really like a collaboration in that sense, which is usually what happens with a client, sometimes not so much, but this one was especially apparent that they were interpreting my drawings, I was taking their interpretations, and it was all sort of getting folded in together. So this is the final illustrations. A lot of the original sketch elements are in there. There's the doors and windows you can see. There's arrows, nodes pointing to things joining from one thing to another. And hopefully that idea of things being able to flip into other things and one plan becoming another plan, vaguely, if not explicitly communicated sometimes. And this was the final book. There was a cover here and a lot of internal illustrations. Now I'll move on to some references now. This is Stephen Beastie, who does a lot of kids' books. Well, they're sort of all ages books, I suppose, but that idea of the cutaway with lots and lots of little details in there really struck me as a young boy wanting to, get inside an aeroplane. I always built little models and had to put together all the little engine, and always found it weird that you would be painting this tiny engine and then the end model, you wouldn't even see it because you painted it into the inside of the model. I kind of like that. But drawing outside of that sort of sculptural process, drawing was kind of magic in a way. There was this ability to show the inside and the outside at the same time, like you can see in this example. There was the ability to draw things that were massive, like buildings, and squash them onto the page. There was this way of bringing things to life that were inanimate, like I've talked about before, cutting things in half like this. And this is a job I did. It's currently being used on a national project for plumbing, a plumbing company in Australia. Reece is one of the biggest plumbing suppliers in Australia. And they wanted to do a cutaway of all these little plumbers working away in different contexts within the city. I've got the little, I think my video is still up while I'm showing this, but this is the actual book too, so wrapped around on the outside. And yeah, that was really like a definite reference to that original influence when I was a kid of those Beastie books and any sort of cutaway stuff, wanting to get right into the nitty gritty of how things work and being playful, wanting to get into the technical engineering side of that, but also being playful by having little treasure chests underground and stuff like that. Little mice running through here and there on the pipes. So being approachable engineering, I guess, is sort of a way of thinking about these drawings that I love making. Where are we up to? This is another book. That I did for Lonely Planet. So this is a How Cities Workbook. Again, I've got that one here as a book. So this was a book that for kids basically, but anyone can have a look. And you open it up and there's lots of different flaps inside that you explore. So heaps of little nitty gritty things of how things are inside the city and how the city works. So, how the underground, how you get to the underground, how air conditioning moves around, how the sewage system works, and all that fun stuff. This is a example of the inside of a spread. So the top one is the closed spread, and then you open it up to reveal more of the interior of that world. So, you know, a little guy in his apartment, a chef cooking dinner, even inside the little boat down on the water, little London-style canal boat. So drawing, basically for me, joined it all together. But the problem I had, I mean, originally when I came out of high school, I wondered if I wanted to be an engineer. You know, all that interest in engineering and drawing those things and those helicopter cutaways, you know, it was, there's a part of me that's like, oh, I think I just want to do that technical drawing and be like a proper, really understand how things work and be able to communicate that. But there was this other side that was sort of wanted to make a mess and wanted to do collage and, you know, ran the gallery and had artists around me and people playing prepared piano, you know, where they stuff foil in and make crazy noises. So there was these sort of two sides of my personality. This illustration was for an editorial piece I did for a newspaper. And I've always held on to it because I felt like it really communicated that split personality I have. There's sort of this control on the right, you know, using rulers and, like I said, interest in engineering. And then there's this part on the side that's all loose and letting it all hang out. So it's a constant duality in my illustration of that. Letting that all sort of hang out together, I guess. Again, that goes back to that Gary process too, of making a mess and refining it to a more structured piece that can be constructed. So this is an example of sort of a sketchbook, drawing things around me. I talked a bit about that. That's sort of been a long time focus, going and drawing outside, drawing all the time, basically. This is me traveling in Italy at a little cafe in a square somewhere. I can remember all these little things just looking at this drawing. I mean, the process of doing drawing and letting mistakes happen on the page, I can sort of almost see the wine stain that we had and the coffee that got spilt on certain things. You know, there's all these little sort of hidden messages in drawings like this that are loose and free that you can sort of pull out and explore in different ways. You know, if you're drawing on a train or something, your lines might be extra wobbly, and then you're like, oh, I remember that guy that was bumping me, and it sort of becomes this extra level of diary writing that's quite nice. The information's there, but it's not really explicit. You know, it's quite, the drawing's organic and the information is a bit organic in that way too. Coffee splotches everywhere. So this would be the illustration side. You know, we talked about this is the sketching sort of side, the letting personal symbols and stuff come into it, and this is the finished illustration that gets applied to different facets, different mediums. And this was one of my first clients. He was actually a friend of mine from high school who became quite a successful Australian musician. And we've always stayed in touch, and I've done projects here and there for him. So this was a fairly recent release where we pulled in a lot of different elements that had been throughout his career. There's even some references to some early artwork that I did. So it's like 10 years after the fact of redrawing elements like that little bird with the heart in it. That was his first album cover that I did. So refolding that back in. But you can see there's still an interest in the things that are around me. You know, I love old suitcases. I love that idea of things being in the suitcase that might be fanciful. Maybe there's a boat in there that talks about traveling. There's all the stuff around Josh's world, you know, guitars, music and stuff like that. So I love just keeping sketchbooks with all that stuff in it and taking those sketches out and applying it to these other worlds that have reference to the client's world as well. You know, so there's a lot of noticing what's around you and noticing what's in another person's world and applying that to different places. So I mentioned obsession before. When I was a kid, I was totally obsessed with drawing. I really wanted to be able to spend time with things. I always sort of remember this drawing I did in preschool, I guess it was, kindergarten, wanting to just do the drawing task. You know, sometimes you have these learning environments where there's different areas that you can explore as a child. You can do the puzzles, you can do the constructor Meccano thing, or you could do the drawing, or you could read some books. And I just sort of wanted to stay on drawing, I remember. And I remember devising a brief sort of for myself and saying, okay, if I'm going to do this, I've got to like come up with the most complicated drawing I can do. And I remember it being a cutaway city, funnily enough. It was like 3 buildings, and I was like, oh, I'm going to draw every spider in between the building. I'm going to draw little mice again under the ground. I'm going to draw the people in the building. I'm going to draw how the buildings connect. And it's funny how it's all sort of come full circle. And then I was only 5 or 6, but yeah, I remember that obsession with wanting to focus on that one task being pretty important. And this, as I was traveling, that Italian travel drawing sort of turned into this, where each city I would visit, I would become obsessed with a certain thing in that city. So whether it's Oregon, and I'm trying to draw raindrops 100 different ways, which is, you're sort of drawing blood from a stone in a way. But where it's some things like bicycles, there's a million different ways you can draw a bicycle. And the beauty of drawing is there's no cost in getting it wrong. There's no one's going to get you in trouble for doing it in your sketchbook. And I felt like every time I drew a bicycle, I would learn something different, whether it's the way the spokes join on, there's sort of a satisfaction to that engineering side of me that learned something every time I redraw it. And sometimes I would try and abstract them. Sometimes I'm like, I'm not going to draw the spokes this time, or I'm just going to draw the handles in this way that's not real, but it looks kind of interesting. Every time you draw the same thing, by the time you get to 20 bikes, you've really got a technique down of how you interpret and see things. You're no longer just taking a glance at something or taking a photo of it and going, that's that bicycle. You're really sitting down and reading that bicycle. You're not looking, you're not seeing. You're reading every little element of it and noticing that, oh, there's that little scratch there, there's that little raindrop sticker or whatever it is. You get extra details if you sit down and draw. And again, with cars, the 10-year-old boy in me could draw cars all day. So I was in LA for this one and really just focused on every kind of car I could find, and really got to look at and enjoyed looking at all the different elements that make up a car, and got better or more stylized in the way I was drawing them. You start to learn how the wheels sit and how you can make a car look sort of puffy or square. And I remember looking at Ferraris and Pininfarina designs for Ferraris like that, and just wanting to do that as a kid. And it's something you can do. You just sit down and try doing it repetitively over and over again, becoming obsessed with one object, blocking everything out that's around that object and focusing on that thing, I think is an important process too. And that's what people also say about my buildings drawings a lot. This is me on the street in New York and drawing in a sketchbook or whatever I have, on the right, it's a nice, beautiful paper black book. On the left, it's just some little notepad that I picked up at a stationery store. But it's that idea of putting on your blinkers, the horse blinkers, and not seeing all of the stuff that's going on, not going, I have to communicate everything on this street. I can look straight down the barrel at this one object, not even draw the buildings next to that building, and just pull out what I can from that one space, whether I'm doing it once, twice, 3 times, 20 times, to get all the little details. You let your eye read across every brick and notice that this door behind me, I'm obviously not drawing that one because I'm facing the other way, but that door's got, that cute little window system going there, which you might not notice on the glance past, but it does make up your interpretation of that building. When you stop and draw it, you see a whole lot of little quirks that you might not have seen if you just walked by and went, oh, it's such a cool street with all these cool buildings. If you stop and make yourself look, you get a whole sort of extra layer of information from the buildings. And as I draw them, they become little characters. The nice thing I've often talked about this project is certain buildings would become like old friends. I'd come down a street and go, oh, I remember this place and that building, and I remember that weird door handle and stuff like that. That might not happen if I hadn't have spent half an hour, 40 minutes, an hour on that street drawing that particular building. This is the same as those other drawings from before from other cities. This was the first sort of New York drawing I did that then turned into this ongoing blog and book. But before I get into that, I just wanted to say a bit more about these building drawings. Or maybe I will go there. Yeah, let's talk about that. So I did that. So these drawings that I was just doing, walking around the street, basically. We lived in New York for 2-3 years, and LA for 3 years or so before that. And coming to New York, I really just wanted to suck out the place more. You know, I felt like it was unfair that I hadn't lived there for all my life. You know, I'd got there and all these things that I'd seen in movies, all these cliches were real and around me, and I wanted to embrace that even more than I could through time. So that idea of standing again and sitting and drawing and concentrating on a place seemed to draw it out in a much more rich, dense way for me. More noticing, letting every line trace every little detail, and seeing it in my own way. I mean, the interesting thing with my drawings is that they're not perfect, like I said before. You couldn't give any of my drawings to a builder and have them build anything. They're not in CAD or whatever. They're not. I don't use rulers. I don't use erasers. I embrace all the wobbly lines. You'll see, you know, this one on the right, the red one. You know, it's the side of the wall's not straight, but there was something about that building that sort of looked like that. You know, it wasn't all straight. It was, you know, it's a sort of dense part of the city that had a bit crumbly buildings here and there, and you know, the paint might have been peeling, and that sort of gets communicated more so by these wobbly lines, these scratchy little fire escapes and stuff. The crunchy black paint that's on that railing comes through maybe more when the lines are all sort of broken up like this. And the reader can pull out other things from that too. I've mentioned that before, but I think the way I draw and the stuff that's left out assumes that the viewer is going to spend a bit more time. You know? I mean, a totally abstract painting, the painter is going to assume that, well, you're either going to look at it and go, walk past in nice colors and walk on, or you're going to sit there and spend a whole lot of time trying to pull out those hidden codes. You know, there's something in being playful, being abstract, and then passing that on to someone else that doesn't know anything, letting them put themselves onto it, let their experience come on. You know, someone might have an experience of going to a building like this red one, and the little air conditioning unit that's on the second floor, they might remember their, you know, partner's air conditioner that was really dodgy. You know, there's lots of narratives that get placed on a drawing in which the detail isn't all there. You know, you look at a CAD drawing or a plan. We recently did some renovations and it's all there. There's all the exact size of the window, exact size of the floor, exact materials, the renderings are perfect. There's no sort of room for interpretation, I guess. It does get into a bit of that with architecture, with artist interpretations, and I think that's why those get used a lot, and I get asked to do that. Sometimes for promotions of new buildings, real estate agents, or for people that are trying to get projects off the ground, developers. There's something in using artists' interpretation, illustrations that have elements that aren't in plans and renderings that other people can see and appreciate what's going to happen down the line. Getting people to do a bit more work when they're looking at a drawing is important. This is another example of a little sort of personal side project, same kind of drawing process, but also now trying to go to different neighborhoods and communicate that neighborhood. So not just pulling out a building and trying to get a sense of a building, but maybe trying to draw a cliche person of the neighborhood. So this might be your classic Brooklyn hipster guy with the amazing beard and the cool clothes and stuff. And this would be the little bodega that he goes to get his coconut water or whatever it is around the corner. So you're just trying to make a little vignette of the place that not only relies on the building to communicate that, but some other elements as well. That sort of turned into a project where I would take my building drawings and add a layer of information onto them. So the title of the building, the address perhaps, and then some little sort of quotes of information that I might have found somewhere online. Not usually stuff like how high it is or when it was built, although I did do that, completed in 1902 for the Flatiron, but more so things that people might not know or quirky little things. So sort of information that matches the style of the drawing in a way. These ones are a bit more sketchy. This one on the left in Carroll Gardens, we lived there, so a little note to myself that Brooklyn smells like bacon because we lived above a bodega just like that other guy did. And every time they cooked in the morning, we call it the bacon alarm. The bacon would waft through the floorboards and we'd smell it. And it's time to get up. And then on the right out, my studio in New York, which had pencils on the side, which was quite relevant. It used to be an old Faber-Castell factory. But there's sort of a meditation in drawing like this, or drawing for the final illustration that's a bit more finished like this, of going into every detail, of focusing on every brick, of trying to draw every window. There's something, once you've drawn sort of the main part of a drawing, you've done the sort of skeleton, the windows, the outside, there's a process of going in, and you can let your mind wander at that point. Maybe you're thinking about other projects that are due, and you can just sit there and focus on drawing every single brick, or drawing every single window, or all the corners, or all the leaves on the tree next door. When you're doing drawing like that, you can really allow your brain to wander and solve other problems. So I might have been working on another client project at that time, and once you've got it all down, you can start to wander around and see where your brain goes to try and solve other things that are around you at the time. Yeah, this is a sort of finished example of one of those drawings where I've taken a whole neighborhood now, drawn the key buildings, and drawn down a lot of information about the buildings and the neighborhood. And there's almost city planning in there. I'm a big fan of reading books about stuff like Jane Jacobs books and stuff like that. So trying to figure out these things that I often get asked about but haven't been formally educated in. And this sort of illustration and documentation of the world around me is a great way to just sort of chip away and get into an understanding of place and time. I mean, this New York project started purely because I wanted to engage with New York on a deeper level. And I really have started to do that with these buildings at this point, taking in information, trying to define certain neighborhoods and presenting that again to different people. And then, yeah, as an illustrator, I would always get asked for commissions of buildings. So I mentioned that before, people see things in the buildings that they can't see otherwise. So they would get representations of buildings done by me. So this one on the left, a guy, it's his motorbike down the bottom and him sort of walking past. And, sometimes they'll want something in a particular apartment window or something like that. But usually it's just they want to see their building in a different light. Especially in New York, they've lived in a place and it's become so romantically entwined with their reality that they want to capture that moment, I suppose. And that's really what I do, capturing a moment of a place and giving that back to them to be able to see in a different way. So I get a lot of those commissions of redrawing different people's buildings. And as that evolved, I had a little exhibition in New York in the Lower East Side in a funny little gallery, and did these sculptures as another layer of interpretation. I mentioned I used to make models and still do a lot of woodwork. And it's always fun to take illustration onto other processes. So these are blocks of wood I found in the neighborhood that I was drawing at the time, and I would then take them back to the studio and paint on them, prime them, sand them, and try and translate that illustration and essence of place onto a three-dimensional object. Taking the obsession on illustration, which I mentioned is very important to me, and I think helps a lot of people get over fear of drawing. Getting right down and focusing on the thing in front of you can help a lot, and drawing it multiple times, as I mentioned. This kind of level of obsession of drawing the whole block, I found. There's a Lower East Side blocks going down one street, next street, up the other street, down the other one. That really gets you to know a place. You know every little shop. Who comes and goes because you're there for quite some time. Sort of you recognize over time too. You'll go back a few months later and sort of building's gone or something new has come up, especially in a place New York where it gets the turnover of development is quite rapid. You get to know every little crack and smell and place and good places to sit, where the sun goes, stuff like that. It's especially for architecture and cities, it's amazing to sit in a place. I know I've worked with a couple of architects that come to a site and spend hours of different times of day trying to get a sense of how that place works. Drawing allows me to do that too. You really get to understand the comings and goings. And, if I was going to come up with a solution of some kind to a place, doing this process would be invaluable. It would take you down paths that you wouldn't think of just sitting in a studio and trying to consider the plan of this neighborhood and how you would go about correcting it or improving it or whatever it is. Yes. What else we got now? There's some more local buildings. Classic. The funny thing about the buildings project for me was I started at wanting to draw buildings that were less famous and more just everyday usable buildings, friends' buildings, my studio, where we lived, in quirky ones you'd find riding through the city. But eventually, as it got the project, I would blog about it at the time. Every day or every 2 days, I'd put up a drawing. And eventually it got quite a lot of exposure, a lot of press. And that's eventually how I got the book deal with Rizzoli to make it into a book series. And that obviously comes with, if you're going to say you're drawing every building, you have to go and draw the famous buildings. So some more recognizable ones like the Empire State, Public Library, Chrysler, Guggenheim, all those classic ones. But I think drawing them in the way I have, this Guggenheim, especially with all these patterns behind it, it again brings that sort of extra level of communication onto something that's so recognizable for everyone. Highlighting things, again, that you might not notice otherwise just walking past. So the buildings book and project took me in a lot of directions. It was a good, amazing start to my career. A lot of people saw it, and clients have then taken what they've seen of my work and interpreted them in a lot of different ways. So it's not that it's been a crazy money maker or anything. Having books is not ridiculous in that regard, but the fact that it's been out there and a lot of people have seen it means a lot of clients have come to me in that through that way of seeing that stuff, and asked me to do things initially which I've thought like, wow, why are you choosing me for this thing? It's like not in my wheelhouse. Sometimes, like this one for the New York Times, was a little drawing about the changing face of Manhattan, which I really felt like I was up for, having done all this sort of personal research in a way of this personal project, just drawing buildings in Midtown, in other places. This one was really relevant to my process. So this was an editorial, just a tiny little piece in the op-ed section, where they came to me and, you have a day and a half to put together a little drawing that goes with this conversation, opinions about the changing face of Manhattan. So yeah, drawing on all those drawings to pull together this abstract interpretation of Midtown changing with the old style building in the middle, surrounded by all that. So it's interesting to see the drawings go into different contexts like that. I mentioned how I got published before. I just, there's a little note there for me to talk about that. But, it was a process of having a personal project, just being obsessed with drawing buildings, building up that big following of people. Oh, this guy's doing these drawings, he's crazy, he reckons he's going to draw them all. Having that sort of point of interest, talking about that, people would get involved. And then eventually it started to get press because I was drawing people's buildings. People would post about that on their blogs, and then bigger blogs post about. Eventually got a sort of profile in newspapers and things. And Rizzoli picked up on that and utilized it to create those books. So we've done, I've got them up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the moment. We've done New York, London, we've done Paris now, and there's Sydney and Melbourne, which I did here with a local publisher. And we've got LA on the way. And yeah, hopefully it just keeps going. The reason we've chosen the cities that we've chosen is because I've spent a fair amount of time in most of these cities. And again, like the New York one, I wanted to spend time getting involved with those places, and doing a book of a place that's full of buildings. You really get to know a place way better. Even Sydney, it was a place that I grew up, but walking the streets and trying to pull out buildings that were, first of all, significant, second of all, friends' buildings, third, just buildings walking around that I thought were interesting, quirky little places. I wanted to draw, buildings that aren't necessarily crazily architecturally significant and bringing them to the fore, sitting that next to the Opera House. I think that's an important thing to do and interesting to do as an illustrator to allow that to happen. So yeah, the buildings books have gone amazingly well. Now, I mentioned a bit earlier about drawing and personal symbols and sketching. You know, that first stage of drawing that's sort of magical, where you can pull anything in, you can draw stuff around you and then cut it in half, and literally cut the drawing in half if you want and stick it on something else and draw another side to it. Putting in a lot of personal symbols. So, your way of representing lettuce or a hamburger, or your ways of representing glasses is different to the next person. And an extreme example of that is this work I did with my brother. So he's got Down syndrome. He's a few years younger than me, and he's always drawn as much as I have, and we've always drawn together. There's a cute Super 8 video my mum has of us drawing together. I think at some stage I grabbed his paintbrush and we fight over a little bit, classic brotherly stuff. But he's continued to have this involvement in a way of drawing that is outside all of that need for visual communication that I trained in. I've trained in this focus on being able to speak to someone else with the drawing, whether those are ephemeral stuff like a coffee stain trying to communicate a whole cafe, or more explicit stuff like drawing a cup and everyone knows it's a cup. My brother has a lot of symbols that are just for him, and when you draw with him, he talks about them too. So he'll be drawing a little thing that's got wiggly legs, and at that moment it's a spider, but then halfway through the drawing he might add something else and he's like, now it's a helicopter, and on initial viewing none of it looks like any of that, but he doesn't care. He's not embarrassed or fearful or of being judged of what he's drawing or that it's not communicating. So they call have a lot of different tangents, but don't manage to cover everything usually. But this is just something I had for a presentation I did a while ago, where I talk about this idea of drawing, where initially most people that haven't drawn or struggle with the blank page, I often get them to do. I've mentioned a lot of my techniques, but I start off by using this, saying there's going to be fear at the beginning. But what you've got to do is put the eraser away. You're not going to undo any mistakes. We love mistakes. Grab a pen, pencil, and just draw this thing in front of you. And it's going to look, potentially it might look incredible first time, but most likely it's not going to. So you're going to go, the first one, the pencil, you'll draw a little scribble or whatever it is, the pencil, the cup or something. And you'll see that, you'll judge it, and you'll draw it again. And those scribbles and weird mistakes and funny things will become a bit more confident. You're like, oh, that's sort of starting to look good second time. You'll look at that again and you'll draw it again. And those squiggles, which you thought were dumb and weird, become more confident, and you're actually exaggerating those squiggles. So those squiggles become part of your style. And the more and more you do this, 20 times, like I said with the bikes before from Berlin and the cars in LA, the 100th car you draw, you're loving it, hopefully. You're confident in the way you're making marks. And you can then feel have an ability to take those to final illustrations. The sketches become more refined. Your little wiggles that you're freaked out about become your way of communicating, and people get to learn and know that that's what certain things mean. I'm lucky enough now that people sort of know my work, and they're like, oh, you always draw, I get that now. You always draw clouds with a flat bottom. And sometimes my 5-year-old daughter says, look, there's a cloud like you draw, because they're not all flat bottomed, but I've just summarized clouds for myself. So you go through this process of drawing clouds, whatever it is, 100 times, and you come to a certain place. So other sort of things to wrap it up. Building that language, I guess, is something that I'm focused on too. A language of the ways of drawing things, clouds, certain ways I draw certain flowers, buildings, definitely. Ways of summarizing things becomes a style for me. And sketching is the way to get to that. Lots and lots of sketching. I've got mountains of books of stuff that I always pull out and utilize. You're basically making a visual library constantly for yourself. You're not always waiting for someone to give you an amazing brief and start making this insane mosaic, dream project straight away. You're always just trying to build up a language of stuff so you can apply to projects like that. I don't just jump into a mosaic like that straight away. It's come from a whole lot of personal exploration and very small, nothing drawings on scraps of paper with people's phone numbers on them, who knows. Summarizing the whole thing, I suppose, the buildings for me, drawings of architecture are important because there's things that allow, they sit still for a start, which is amazing, but the fact that they are so familiar as an object and especially when you're drawing a famous one, that ability of illustration and sketching to be able to distill them into another plane, whether it's super simplified or quite dense and every brick, that you can communicate different things with illustration that aren't necessarily in reality. You can highlight things that people might not notice. You can pull out little narratives that are particular to you or someone else that's involved with that building. So there's a power there that anyone can utilize, and you can get there by sketching and drawing and going down different paths, different tangents with your drawing. So go forth and draw is my finishing note. And that's me for now, for all this stuff. I hope you enjoyed everything that I've talked about, and I'd love to answer some questions now, if that's where we're up to. Who are we gonna?
Thanks, James. Yeah. So if anyone in the audience has questions, please use the Q&A feature. I want to get to a few. I know we're at 7:30 right now, but if you can hold on for a few minutes, I just want to run through a couple. So thank you for your presentation. Super thoughtful, and your work is pretty. It's very refreshing, given my background in architecture, to see someone that wasn't trained in architecture look at the built environment and interpret that through a very playful, whimsical way. So you're doing great stuff.
Thanks.
I'm thrilled that we connected because I actually have to confess I own I think three of your books, all the buildings in. Yeah, I think it's New York and Paris and London. So and I've been obviously to I've been to New York and London. I have yet to go to Paris, but it's inspiring and sifting through the book, you're kind of looking at buildings and I want to go here on my itinerary and that kind of thing. So
yeah.
So
yeah,
cool.
I've definitely had people use those books as guidebooks. I had a guy from Sydney email me saying, "Oh, I took your New York book with me and went around and looked at the buildings." And it's that's a funny sort of feedback loop, isn't it? Where I'm sort of presenting these buildings that people haven't seen, and then that's their version, and they go and have a look at it. And that's what happened to me when I first arrived in New York. I knew every building already. I was like pointing, and that's that building. That's from films. That's King Kong's building. That's whatever else it is. And that layer of understanding gets muddled up somehow. Drawing was a good way to play with that. Yeah.
So how long do you typically spend researching buildings to draw, and then how long do you spend drawing in each city?
Depends on the context. So when I was in New York doing the blog, it was just, I like that building, and I'd stop on my bike and pull out the sketchbook and start drawing. And it could be anywhere from, we had that first slide with the Flatiron building drawn in a few different ways. So the one on the left was pretty sketchy, and that would take 15 minutes or so. You're just trying to get it down quick because, I don't know, maybe you're on your way somewhere. But sometimes you might have, I actually love it when I've got time to kill. I'm in a meeting or waiting for a meeting, or I'm early for something. I love being early for things. Like I'm often early to pick up my kids, and I'll sit outside the school and draw the building across the road, because that's there's no distractions. You've got nothing else to do. Whereas if you're in the studio, sometimes I can find I can check the internet, I can make some ceramics, or like, to have this sort of focus is quite nice. So doing a finished illustration might be 2 hours or something, a couple of hours if you're doing like collage and ink and letting it dry and playing with it and wanting to work quite big, like A3, A2 sort of size, can get kind of getting into every brick. But like I said, that sort of time's useful as well, getting into that meditation and letting the time elapse while you draw is fun as well.
What's your preferred medium to use?
Medium. Well, again, depends on the context. When I'm working with a client, I'm on a tablet. So it's whether it's the iPad or a Wacom tablet into Photoshop, that just allows for speed and flexibility. If they come back and say, make it pink, I can just layer it and make it pink. Whereas if it's for the buildings books, I can really, it's my project. There's no client really. I mean, the editor never really says anything apart from spell checking. So got the ink out. I've got, like a classic nib pen and scissors and, woodworking glue and all this sort of mess, just playfully putting it on the page and making mistakes. And you can't change anything once that's done. You can't go in and remove parts because it's all stuck to the page and you've done, wash of pink all over it. You can't, it's hard to adjust that. So, medium is usually related to the brief and the context and the client, whether it's myself or a big multinational.
Yeah, it sounds like digital tools and digital process is part of your process, but physical drawing with pen and ink and actual paper. How do you translate an actual your physical drawings into a digital format and make them look the way they do?
You mean, how do I technically get it onto the computer? Or
yeah. How do you do that? And is it how do you sort of finesse it to get? You have a very your illustrations have a very specific look to them.
Yeah, well, I mean, the ones like the plumbing one that I show, the cutaway one, that's all done digitally. So you're using fake brushes that look a little bit like a pencil or something, but they're definitely a bit neater, so then there's no process of bringing that in. It's in the computer already, so that's all good. But I do try to keep it loose. I color in a bit messy and on the computer and try to let the lines flow and not try to let the computer make stuff too tight. But technically bringing the ink and stuff drawings in, I'm just using a scanner. I've got a big scanner that I put it on and bring it in, and usually, it's sort of a bit disappointing. It might have a bit of kink to it, or it flattens it too much because there's sort of a physicality to a drawing, especially if you're doing collage where there's height to certain thicknesses of paper and they cast shadows that are interesting. So bringing those in for the book, for the books, you sort of need to fake that sometimes. You might need to put a little scan, you might need to scan in a bit of mess, So I've got these folders of scans of just ink blobs and stuff that might not have got picked up on the original drawing, or the coffee stain that I mentioned. You might have to bring in some more coffee stains and put more of them on to emulate that look of whatever it is that's happening in the real world.
Awesome. You seem to like to play with perspective. Can you talk a little bit more about your approach to that?
Yeah, I mean, whenever I've done drawing classes, people, especially for buildings, they're like, I think they expect the first thing's going to be perspective. How do we draw perspective? And I've taught perspective. I learned perspective, and my son gets right into it, doing single point, double point. I did it all in engineering, science, drawing, technical drawing stuff, different mechanical pencil thicknesses to communicate different materials and all that stuff. But I sort of, the thing that's interesting about my drawings is not that, like knowing those things is fine, and I think you have to know them, but being able to play with them is important. What's that quote about? You've got to know the rules to break them or whatever. So I've learned perspective, but now I sort of don't do it correctly. I definitely squish things and try to flatten the front of a building, and then the sides just going off. So it's this sort of extreme single point that doesn't really work. And then I'm happy to break that too. The building next to it might be on the other perspective, because I wanted to see the other side of another building. And that's the sort of visual art, personal stuff coming through, rather than the correct CAD, rendering view coming through. There's something more interesting for me in drawing one thing over another and letting the drawing sort of evolve on the page. Sometimes you might not have enough space to do the right perspective on the right side, so you do it on the other side, and it looks kind of funky and weird, but that funk is what people appreciate and see, and allows them to see something different in the drawing.
So 2 more questions, because we are way over time. We've got a couple people still hanging out with us, which I'm thankful for. So what can we look for? What's on your drawing board? Any future projects coming up that we should be aware of?
Oh, crikey, what's around me? Well, I just did another one of those Lonely Planet books about space. That was pretty exciting. So those flat books. Yesterday I did this commission for someone, an ink drawing of their beautiful house in a rural town in Australia. So that was fun. That's pretty straight. You know what I mean? There's none of that collage. It's pretty clienty, if you want me to say that. There's no weird collage or messes much going on in that. I'm actually working on an exhibition. I mentioned sort of going away from visual art when it was early days and towards illustration. I ran that gallery, but then I sort of progressed towards doing more of the client work. And you'll see in the background there's some woodwork stuff going up there. So some more non-communicative, non-commercial work being created. I'm doing some collage in that same ilk, where sort of forms of the local environment. I'm in this rainforest studio at the moment that we talked about. So pulling out, abstracting some of the vine forms and the different types of trees that we have into just whether it's a donut shape or a circle or something, and seeing what that happens and simplifying the colors, because the bush is quite dense and complicated. It's hard to focus in on particular things. So that's an interesting process. Trying to apply that similar building focus process to the natural world can be a bit tricky. So just seeing where that's going at the moment.
Awesome. Okay, last question. What can you tell us about this secret rainforest cabin that you are currently reside?
Yeah, well, it's in the rainforest. I think what do we call it? It's subtemperate rainforest. So it's yeah, there's a lot of vines. We're south of Sydney, up in the mountains. Not that they're that big of mountains. Don't be thinking Colorado or anything. Our mountains are more like hills. But yeah, there's a creek that we swim in the summer down the bottom, and yeah, where people come and think we're like totally intrepid off-grid people, but we are connected to the internet. I mean, this is pretty amazing, isn't it? That I'm in this rainforest context with lyrebirds and wombats walking around outside, and you guys are wherever you are, and we're halfway across the world sharing these techniques and ideas. I mean, you stop to think about it, it's pretty amazing.
Very nice. Well, James, this has been fantastic. Again, your work is super refreshing. I'm so glad we connected. Thanks for doing this tonight.
No problem. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. So for those left in the audience, next month, we welcome New York City-based scenic designer Beowulf Borrett, who will share the ins and outs of designing sets for theatrical plays and musicals. So join us then. You can find this and other Architecture Everywhere programs, of course, on our website at aiadc.com/calendar. So that's it. This concludes our program. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. Take care. Thanks, James.